Good afternoon. I am more or less blinding myself with a lamp with the shade off because it is a very overcast day outside and I can't seem to get the right angle so you can see me. But anyway, I'm here to do a review of In the Cafe of Lost Youth by Patrick Modiano, translated by Chris Clarke. I remembered the translator this time. Translators are very important. This book, in this edition, the New York Review of Books edition, was released on March 8th of this month, and as you can see, it's a pretty thin book. It was originally published in 2007, I'm pretty sure, 2007 in French originally, and I'm not sure, but I think this is the first English translation, possibly. At the very least, it's the first release of the translation by Chris Clarke, I believe. So this novel is set in the 1950s. I don't think the characters or the narrators actually mention it specifically, but it seems to be the 50s based on the atmosphere and and based on the synopsis on the back. So this novel has a number of characters, a number of narrators, and they're looking back on their youth, their time in the 1950s, their time at a specific cafe that they frequented together and apart. We have a number of interesting characters, some of them writers, some of them pretending to be students, some of them who are basically drinking their lives away in this cafe. But they're all remembering how they first met a particular young woman, their feelings towards her, their experience with life in the time that they knew her, and she went by the name of Luki. She was a very mysterious character. Everybody that met her seemed to be connected to her, to fall in love with her, and the characters have lost track of her. She's no longer in their lives. By the end of the novel, you find out indeed what has happened to her. It's a very romanticized version of Paris, but not so romantic, because in fact the characters are quite depressing in many ways, but it left me feeling very calm, very serene, a little bit sad, but very satisfied overall. I want to read a passage from here. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages that I really enjoyed. I think I read this passage 2 or 3 times as I was reading the book. It's a short book. When I read shorter books, I tend to stop and savor it a little more. So on page 87, he writes, "I experienced a strange feeling that morning as I walked through Cambron Square, because it had always been night when we had gone to see Guy de Vere. I pushed open the gate and told myself that there was no way I would run into him after all this time. No more Vega bookstore on Boulevard Saint-Germain, and no more Guy de Vere in Paris, and no more Luki. But there, running along the ground floor window, was the ivy, just as it had been in my dream, that disturbed me. Had the other night really been a dream? I lingered a moment, standing motionless at the window. I was hoping I would hear Loki's voice. She would call out my name once again. No, nothing, silence. Yet I had the impression that since those days at Guy de Vere's, no time had passed. Instead, it had stood still, frozen in some sort of eternity. I remembered the text I had been trying to write back then when I knew Luki. I had called it On Neutral Zones. There was a series of transitional zones in Paris, no man's land, where we were on the border of everything else, in transit or even held suspended. Within, we benefited from a certain kind of immunity. I might have called them free zones, but neutral zones was more precise. One evening at the Condé, I had asked Maurice Raphael his opinion, knowing that he was a writer. He shrugged his shoulders and shot me a sardonic smile. That's for you to figure out, my friend. I don't really understand where you're trying to go with this. I'd stick with neutral and leave it at that. Cambron Square, as well as the neighborhood that lay between Ségur and Duplex, and all those streets that led to the footbridges of the above-ground metro. They all belonged to a neutral zone, and it wasn't by chance that I had met Lukey there. I've long since lost that text, 5 pages that I had typed in a typewriter, lent to me by Zacharias, a customer at the Conde. On the dedication page I had written for Lukey of the neutral zones. I don't know what she thought of my work. I don't think she had read it all the way through. It was a somewhat off-putting text, a compiled list of the names of streets, arrondissement by arrondissement, that demarcated the neutral zones, sometimes a block of houses, sometimes a larger area. Upon reading the dedication one afternoon at the Conde, she said to me, "You know, Roland, we could go and live a week in each of these areas you're talking about." I remember the night she decided she wouldn't go home to her husband anymore. At the Conde that day, she had introduced me to Edmond and Ali Sharif. Or Ali Sharif, perhaps. I was hauling around the typewriter that Zacharias had lent me. I wanted to start on neutral zones. I placed the typewriter on the small pitch pine table in my room. I already had the opening sentence in my mind. Neutral zones have at least one advantage. They are only a starting point, and we always leave them sooner or later. I was aware that once I sat down in front of the typewriter, everything would be much less straightforward. I would likely end up crossing out that first sentence, and the following one, and yet I found myself full of courage and resolve. She was expected back in Neuilly for dinner, but at 8 o'clock she was still stretched out on the bed. She didn't even switch on the bedside lamp. Eventually I let her know it was time. Time to what? From the tone of her voice I understood that she would never again take the metro out to Sablons. A long silence passed between us. I sat down in front of the typewriter and tapped my fingers lightly to the keys. So we find out quite early on that Lukey has left her much older husband. We find out that she kind of drifts from place to place. She likes to, she finds it most comfortable to cut herself off from the people in her life and disappear. She's done this more than once. She chooses, when the time comes, to basically walk out of her life and never come back. So one of the main narrators in this novel is really obsessed with the idea of eternal recurrence, which has to do with recurring events in the universe, I guess. I don't know much about it, but the one character is really obsessed with that, as he's a little obsessed with Loki as well, and what happened to her. And somehow that all ties into this idea of neutral zones and neutral spaces. It's a really interesting book in that sense. The characters are really interesting. It's as if he never got out of that 1950s intellectual atmosphere that's spurring him on to keep remembering and romanticizing that cafe culture, that kind of intellectual or faux intellectual, in the case of many of the characters, that atmosphere. It made me want to read more about Paris. It draws you into that cafe culture of Paris in the same way that Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast would. Not as good as Hemingway, but quite good. I would highly recommend you pick this up. In the Cafe of Lost Youth by Patrick Modiano.